Okay, so today we're diving into something pretty big,
Yeah,
a plan, so to speak, to really boost the number of people living in Canada's north.
that's it. Yeah, we've been going deep on this report. It's called A Comprehensive Imperative. Catch subtitle there. Populating the Canadian North for Sovereignty, Sustainability, and
Oh,
Prosperity.
wow, that's a mouthful.
It is. And it really gets into the nuts and bolts of how this could actually happen, not just the why.
I like that. So what we're going to do today is pull out the really important stuff for you guys, right? Like, what are the main arguments behind this whole idea? What are the things that could totally change the game? And what kind of surprising stuff did we find when we dug into this report?
Totally. And we're talking about everything from Canada's role on the world stage to whole new economies popping up in the Arctic.
Let's get started.
All right, so right off the bat, this report hits you with the sovereignty argument. And what's really interesting here is how it links a bigger population directly to a stronger Canadian presence, like a way of really showing who's in charge in a place that's getting more and more attention globally.
Right. So they're saying that because we don't have a lot of people up north right now,
Right.
big parts of it are basically unwatched, which is kind of a problem.
Yeah.
Okay, so how do they propose fixing that? It can't just be, hey, everyone move north, can it?
No, definitely not. It's way more complex than that they have this whole multi-pronged strategy.
Okay.
One really interesting idea is to create like really strong incentives for people to make the North their permanent home,
Hmm.
right?
Okay.
The idea is more long-term residents mean more people who are keeping an eye on things naturally.
Makes sense, like more eyes and ears on the ground.
Exactly, and they even model the system of like escalating tax credits. So the longer you live in the North, the less tax you pay overall
Wow.
compared to the rest of Canada. So it's not just a little bonus. It's a real advantage to putting down roots up there.
Yeah, that paints a much clearer picture of how these incentives could really work.
It's about building a lasting connection to the North.
For sure, what other ways do they talk about boosting that on-the-ground presence, increasing that sense of sovereignty?
They're really big on supporting and expanding community-based observation programs and giving local ranger initiatives more reach and resources.
Oh, that's interesting.
The thinking is these are the people who know the land best.
For sure.
So empowering them to be part of this broader monitoring network just makes a lot of sense. It's about leveraging the knowledge that's already there.
I like that it's about recognizing the folks who are already up there.
Absolutely.
Now, the report also talks about local governments and cultural institutions playing a role in asserting sovereignty.
Right.
That's kind of cool. How does that work?
Think of it this way. Strong communities with governments that are really working well, providing services and all that, coupled with cultural centers that are celebrating Northern identity.
Yeah.
Those are powerful signs of Canada being present and committed. Right.
I see what you mean.
It's about showing the world that these aren't just random outposts. They're vital parts of Canada.
Yeah, so it's not just about bodies being up north. It's about having real Canadian communities that can thrive on their own.
Right.
Now, this idea of dual-use infrastructure, that sounds really smart.
Yeah.
Can you unpack that a little bit?
Sure. So the report is all about developing things like transportation networks, communication systems, logistical hubs, but doing it in a way that benefits both regular people and potential security needs.
Oh, I get it. So like a road that connects remote communities.
Exactly.
Helps people get around, but also lets security forces get in if they need to.
Exactly. Or high-speed internet.
Yeah.
Crucial for daily life, education, business, but it also really boosts defense communication.
That's a really clever way to make the most of that investment.
Yeah.
Building stuff that helps people now, but also strengthens our position strategically.
Exactly.
Now, what about actually getting Northerners involved in those security roles?
The report pushes for a lot more Northern participation in things like the Canadian Rangers and Reserve Forces. And obviously a bigger population means a bigger pool of potential recruits.
Of course.
But more than that, these are people who understand the North, like the back of their hand, the terrain, the weather.
It makes a huge difference.
It makes them super effective. That local knowledge, you just can't teach that.
Absolutely not. Finally, on the sovereignty side of things, the report talks about Canada's place in the world. How does a bigger population in the North help with that?
Okay, so think about the big picture geopolitically.
Yeah.
A growing and active population up north gives Canada more weight when we're talking about Arctic issues internationally.
That makes sense.
When we show that we're serious about developing and living in our North, our stance on things like protecting the environment, sustainable development, governing Arctic waters, it all carries more weight.
I see.
It shows we're not just putting a flag down, we're building a future there.
That makes a lot of sense. All right, so
Yeah.
that gives us a really solid grasp of the sovereignty arguments.
Yeah.
Now, let's shift gears to something that might sound a little strange at first, climate change. Yeah.
Creating opportunities in the North, I mean, that feels a bit like a contradiction.
It's definitely nuanced, and the report is super clear that fighting climate change is still the #1 priority.
Okay,
But it also says that Canada needs to be smart about adapting to the changes that are already happening in the Arctic.
that's fair.
And one thing that really stands out is this whole discussion about new Arctic sea routes opening up.
Right, so as the ice melts, these routes could become real options for shipping,
Exactly. And they could become major trade routes.
like the Northwest Passage.
Exactly. That's the big one.
So how does the report say we should get ready for that and actually make the most of it?
It says we need to invest big time in building and upgrading port infrastructure along those potential routes.
Okay.
We're talking deep water ports that can handle those huge ships
Oh.
and putting in place all the safety and regulations to manage this new era of Arctic shipping.
Gotcha. That all makes sense.
But here's the key part. It also says we got to train people in the North to take advantage of the jobs that'll come with all this stuff. Right, because it's not just about building the ports themselves. It's
Exactly.
about making sure Northerners can be the ones sailing the ships, managing the logistics, monitoring the environment, all that.
Absolutely.
Now, another point the report brings up is that resources that were once out of reach are now becoming accessible because of melting permafrost and less ice cover.
Right.
That seems like a big deal. What's their take on that?
They're both excited and cautious.
Okay.
They recognize the potential of getting to those mineral oil and gas deposits,
Hmm.
but they're adamant that any development has to be done super carefully.
For sure.
Strictest environmental rules, real partnership with indigenous communities, impact assessments,
Mm.
the highest sustainability standards, making sure the benefits are shared fairly with indigenous people.
That makes sense because those resources are on their land.
Exactly. The focus is on responsible and sustainable development, not just a mad rush for resources.
That approach is so important given how sensitive the environment is up there and the rights of indigenous communities.
Oh,
Now, what about other, maybe less obvious economic opportunities?
right.
They mentioned agriculture, which really caught my eye.
Yeah, that's interesting, right?
Because it's the Arctic.
I know.
Because how's that going to work?
Well, as temperatures rise and the growing season potentially gets longer,
Okay.
some parts of the North could actually become viable for farming.
Wow.
It could mean more locally grown food, less reliance on expensive stuff shipped in, and new economic opportunities in those communities.
So like community gardens, small farms, that sort of thing.
Exactly. The report recommends doing research into cold climate farming techniques and supporting those local food initiatives.
It's kind of mind-blowing to think about fresh local produce becoming more common in the North.
It is.
And then there's the whole ecotourism thing and scientific research, which are definitely growing up there.
Huge growth. That unique environment is drawing more and more tourists looking for something different and researchers studying climate change.
Makes sense.
The report says we need to build tourism infrastructure that doesn't harm the environment and respects local cultures
For sure.
and support research centers in the North with a focus on training and employing local people in both those sectors.
It seems like the key across all these opportunities is making sure Northerners are in the driver's seat.
Absolutely.
Okay, last thing on climate change. The report suggests that the North could become a hub for developing technologies and expertise related to adapting to climate change.
Yeah.
I mean, who better to come up with solutions for Arctic conditions than the people who live there, right?
Exactly. A bigger population could really drive innovation in things like building infrastructure that can handle thawing permafrost,
Oh, that's a good point.
early warning systems for extreme weather, sustainable building techniques for cold climates.
Makes sense.
And this wouldn't just benefit the North.
Right.
It could make Canada a leader in those technologies, which would be valuable all over the world.
So the North could be like a real-life lab for climate resilience. Okay, let's zoom out a bit and talk about the overall economic potential of the North beyond just the impacts of climate change.
Okay.
What other untapped resources does the report highlight?
The report emphasizes the incredible amount of natural resources in the North.
Okay.
We're talking minerals, oil, gas, and a huge potential for renewable energy.
Ah.
The strategy they lay out involves setting up clear and efficient regulations that protect the environment to encourage responsible development.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, as we've talked about, Indigenous participation and environmental protection are non-negotiables.
So basically create a stable and predictable environment for investment, but with strong protections in place.
Exactly.
The report is also really big on investing in renewable energy within the North itself, isn't it?
Oh yeah, the North has huge potential for hydro, wind, geothermal energy.
Right.
Investing those projects would help communities move away from expensive and polluting fossil fuels.
Which also creates jobs.
And creates jobs, exactly. And it helps Canada reach its climate goals.
So it's a win-win if it's done right.
For sure.
Now, what about supporting local businesses and entrepreneurs? What specific things do they recommend for that?
They talk about targeted programs and financial incentives specifically for northern businesses.
Okay.
Things like better access to funding mentorship programs that understand the unique challenges of doing business up north and making regulations less complicated.
Because those can be a real burden for small businesses, especially in remote areas.
Absolutely. The idea is to create a diverse and strong economy. Everything from tourism and arts to processing local resources and tech startups.
Building that whole ecosystem from the ground up.
Exactly.
And a big part of that is having a skilled workforce.
Absolutely crucial. The report really stresses the need to invest in education and training programs that line up with what northern industries need, both now and in the future.
Makes sense.
We're talking expanding trade schools,
Yeah.
increasing access to post-secondary education within the North itself, and attracting and keeping skilled workers in key areas like healthcare infrastructure, resource management.
It's true, you can have all the potential in the world. But if you don't have the people with the right skills,
It goes nowhere.
it goes nowhere. The report also talks about improving connections within the North and with the rest of Canada.
Yeah, that's key for unlocking the economic potential.
For sure.
Investing in things like all-weather roads, airports, ports, and of course really boosting communication, especially digital stuff like high-speed internet and reliable cell service.
It's huge.
It is, because better connections mean more trade, better business operations, better access to services, and it just makes life better for people in remote communities by connecting them with each other, the rest of Canada, and the global economy.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine a thriving economy without those things.
Absolutely.
Okay, last thing on the economic front. The report talks about fostering innovation and tech hubs in the North.
Yeah.
What's the thinking behind that?
It's about strategically creating incentives to attract research facilities and tech startups to the North,
Okay.
specifically ones that are focused on solving the unique challenges and opportunities of the Arctic.
So things like Arctic engineering, sustainable resource management, remote sensing technology for monitoring the environment, that sort of thing.
Exactly. The goal is to turn the North into a center of expertise and innovation for Arctic issues.
Which could have implications for the whole planet.
Exactly.
All right, so we've covered the main arguments for this big population push sovereignty, climate change opportunities, and the economic potential. Now let's get down to brass tacks. What are the key policy recommendations they actually propose to make this happen?
This is where the report gets really detailed, laying out a whole set of policy tools.
Okay.
A big part of it is a package of financial incentives designed to make living and working in the North more appealing and affordable.
Like what kind of incentives?
Well, we're talking big northern residency tax credits that get bigger the longer you stay there.
Wow.
Significant relocation grants to help with the cost of moving and setting up a home, even student loan forgiveness programs for grads who commit to working up north for a certain amount of time.
Those are some pretty serious perks.
They are. It's about making a real difference.
What other financial supports do they suggest?
They also propose boosting the child benefit program specifically for the North because it's so much more expensive to raise kids there.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And then subsidized housing initiatives and programs to make it easier to get affordable land.
So really tackling that cost of living issue head on.
Exactly.
Now, beyond money for individuals, what about big infrastructure projects? What do they recommend there?
The report calls for a huge and fast-tracked investment in basic infrastructure across the North.
Okay.
Things like finally finishing those all-weather road networks to connect those isolated communities year-round.
Right.
Developing and upgrading deep-water ports and airports to improve transportation links.
Makes sense.
And of course, rolling out reliable high-speed internet and cell service to bridge that digital divide.
That would be a massive undertaking, but it would really change the lives of people up north.
Absolutely.
What about energy and utilities? Those are pretty crucial up there.
Super crucial. The report stresses the need to invest in modern sustainable energy grids, prioritizing renewable sources like hydro, wind, geothermal,
Right.
and using things like microgrid technology to make the energy supply more secure and reduce that reliance on fossil fuels. They also say we need to invest in water and sanitation systems that can handle climate change.
Yeah, that's essential for public health and the environment.
Absolutely, though. Those are the building blocks for strong communities.
The report also talks about investing in human capital.
Right.
What does that look like in practice?
It means strengthening and expanding educational institutions at all levels in the North.
Okay,
So trade schools that teach the skills that industries need right now,
right.
universities with programs focused on Arctic studies and relevant skills.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It also calls for way more funding for healthcare and strong incentives to attract and keep qualified healthcare professionals in those remote areas.
That's so important because if you don't have good schools and hospitals,
People won't stay.
people won't come and they won't stay.
Exactly. Access to quality education and healthcare is essential for attracting and keeping families and building a healthy and productive population.
Yeah, because those things are fundamental to quality of life.
Totally.
And they also talk about the need to respect and support indigenous culture and languages within the education system.
Absolutely. They recommend creating culturally relevant curriculum that reflects the history, knowledge, and perspectives of indigenous peoples, and providing strong support for preserving and revitalizing indigenous languages.
Which goes back to that idea of making sure that Northerners benefit directly from development in the region.
Absolutely.
Now, a huge part of doing any development in the North the right way is having a strong relationship with indigenous communities.
Absolutely.
What are the key recommendations in that area?
The report is crystal clear. We need to fully empower indigenous self-determination and build real partnerships.
Okay.
This starts with fully implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDROP, which lays out the rights of indigenous peoples. It also says we need to establish real and fair consultation and co-management processes for any development projects on indigenous land.
Yeah, so not just checking a box, but actually collaborating and sharing decision-making power.
Exactly. What else is there? They also talk about actively supporting indigenous-led economic development,
Okay.
making sure benefits are shared fairly from any resource extraction on their land,
Right.
and investing in building capacity within indigenous communities so they can fully participate in the economy and governance,
Yeah, that makes sense.
and supporting their self-governance institutions. It's a whole approach based on respect, recognizing rights, and shared prosperity.
Sounds like a real commitment to doing things the right way.
It does.
Now, to actually get more people to move north, the report outlines some specific immigration strategies.
Yeah, they propose creating special immigration streams with faster processing for skilled workers and entrepreneurs whose skills match what the North needs.
That's
And they also suggest outreach and recruitment programs, specifically aimed at people who might be interested in the Northern lifestyle,
okay.
and providing support services that help them adjust to life in Northern communities.
So making it easier for the right people to immigrate and giving them the support they need to thrive once they get there.
Exactly.
They also talk about fostering a culture of research and innovation in the North.
Right. They recommend setting up dedicated funding for Arctic-focused research and development,
Okay.
especially in areas like adapting to climate change, sustainably managing resources, and renewable energy technologies. They also suggest creating incentives for universities and research institutions to be more active in the North and supporting the development of Northern-specific technologies.
Turning the region into a real hub of knowledge and solutions.
Exactly.
And finally, they talk about streamlining government and regulations to support all this.
Yeah, they're talking about reviewing and simplifying existing regulations to make responsible development easier, while still keeping those high environmental and social standards.
Right. So making sure the rules are clear and efficient, but still protective.
Exactly. They also call for better coordination between different levels of government on Northern issues and investing in better data collection to make sure decisions are based on evidence and to track the progress of this whole population strategy.
Okay, so we've covered the recommendations pretty thoroughly,
We have.
but the report also acknowledges that a plan this big is going to come with challenges.
Definitely.
What are some of the main hurdles they foresee?
Well, the high cost of living is a big one.
Of course.
But the report directly addresses that with those mitigation strategies we talked about earlier.
Right, the financial incentives, housing subsidies, supporting local food production, making transportation more efficient.
Exactly. That's about making it more affordable to live up there.
What about remoteness and that feeling of isolation that people might experience in some communities?
That's a real concern, and the report acknowledges it. They emphasize that investing in transportation and communication infrastructure is crucial.
Right. Those connections are key.
They also suggest promoting strong community ties through local programs and using things like telehealth and online learning to provide services and reduce that sense of isolation.
So using technology and community building to combat the downsides of distance.
Exactly.
And of course, we can't talk about the North without talking about climate change and how it's directly affecting communities and infrastructure.
Absolutely. The report stresses the need for infrastructure that can withstand thawing permafrost and more extreme weather,
Yeah.
investing in adaptation technologies and having strong emergency plans in place.
To make sure people are safe.
Exactly.
And environmental protection has got to be top of mind, too.
Definitely, the report says that strong environmental regulations, thorough impact assessments, and a commitment to sustainable practices are absolutely essential.
It can't be development at all costs.
No way. Protecting that unique environment has to be a core principle.
Now, what about the cultural side of things? The North has so many different cultures, especially indigenous cultures.
The report highlights the need to promote cross-cultural understanding,
Yeah.
support indigenous cultures and languages, and create welcoming communities where both long-term residents and newcomers feel respected.
It's about building those bridges.
Exactly. Successful integration requires being sensitive to different cultures and respecting each other.
Okay, so last but not least, how do we attract and, more importantly, keep more people in the North over the long term?
The report argues that the whole package they've laid out, the financial incentives, the infrastructure improvements, the quality of life initiatives, those are designed to make the North a desirable place to live, work, and raise a family.
Right. It has to be about more than just getting people there.
Exactly. But they also emphasize the need to keep listening to Northerners to evaluate whether these policies are actually working,
Okay.
and to be willing to adapt based on feedback and changing needs.
So it's not a one and done situation?
Not at all. It's a long-term commitment.
So to sum it all up, this report, a comprehensive imperative lays out a really ambitious and multifaceted plan to significantly grow the population of Canada's North.
Mhm.
The main arguments are about strengthening our sovereignty in a changing world, taking advantage of the opportunities presented by climate change, and unlocking the huge economic potential of the region.
And it's not just a bunch of vague ideas.
Right.
It gets into very specific policy recommendations.
Mhm.
Everything from those big financial incentives and infrastructure investments to initiatives in education, healthcare, and empowering Indigenous communities.
And importantly, it acknowledges the challenges and suggests ways to address them.
Exactly.
So now you have a good understanding of the core arguments, the policy recommendations, and the potential hurdles associated with this proposal.
It's a lot to digest,
It is a lot.
but it brings up a really crucial question for you, our listener. Considering how big and ambitious this plan is, what do you think is the single most important factor that will determine whether it succeeds or fails?
Yeah, that's a good one.
And looking beyond what they're aiming for, what unexpected consequences could come from such a massive change in this really unique part of Canada?
Food for thought.
Definitely.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
We'll catch you next time.
See ya.